podcast where we talk to smart people, but not necessarily done by smart people?
That is an awesome question.
This one goes down probably on one of my top 5.
Hey, I like nutrition. I like to eat food.
This is the coolest thing ever. We're going to do this forever.
I wish I paid more attention in that class.
You know, I'm going to be honest, I don't understand that. As a man, I don't get it.
Welcome to smartpeoplepodcast.com.
Hello and welcome to Smart People Podcast, conversations that satisfy your curious mind. Chris Stemp here, and thank you for joining us. I'm really happy that I can put this episode out into the world. To me, the conversation that I had with our guest this week and the ability to deliver this to so many around the world is just a reminder of why John and I do this and why I continue to search for things and topics and people that are going to change the way I think. You know, I believe in our lives we have inflection points, and we never know when they're going to happen, and they're not always things we wanted, but they change us. And I can imagine this episode and reading this book being one of those inflection points for me, and perhaps for you. Now, I will say this episode's a little deep, but what's the point of spending an hour listening to something if you don't get deep? If you don't change the way you think about something, or at least be willing to approach it from somewhere else? This week, we're talking about living through the lens of dying. And our guest this week contends that we cannot be truly alive without maintaining an awareness of death. This week, we're interviewing Frank Ostaseski, and we're discussing, amongst a few things, his new book, The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. And again, I reiterate, it's not so much about death, although yes, it is about that. It's about how to use the understanding of death, the experience of death, to live the way we want. And I really can't think of a better person to walk us down this path to shed some light on this than Frank. Frank is the co-founder of the Zen Hospice Project. He's founder of the Metta Institute. He's a Buddhist teacher, an international lecturer, and a leading voice in contemplative end-of-life care. He's been honored by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and AARP named him one of America's 50 most innovative people. And what all this means is Frank has basically dedicated his life to helping people die and helping people process death. And he's done this with thousands of people. He's been there at their bedside in the last minutes of their life. And he takes this Zen approach, although he does it without forcing any type of dogma. And in this episode, we try to tap into a little bit of what he's learned in a lifetime of this, as well as what he reveals in his book, The 5 Invitations. You can learn more about Frank and his book, along with additional resources, at 5invitations.com. That's the word 5, F-I-V-E, invitations.com. And the website really has some incredible resources on how to live life more fully, how to be a mindful healthcare professional, how to be a compassionate companion. And one that hits home for many people is if you're facing loss or living with illness, some resources for that. So I'm really honored to be able to bring this conversation with Frank to you. I hope it can meet you where you are and perhaps add to the richness of your life. We are at smartpeoplepodcast.com. You can go there for show notes, sign up for the newsletter, and stay in touch with us. I'd love to hear from you, hear your thoughts. Also, if you want to share your thoughts on iTunes, and really share the episode if you enjoy it. Put it on social, share it with friends, change someone's life. You never know. All right, here it is, our interview with Frank Ostaseski as we discuss the 5 invitations, discovering what death can teach us about living fully. Enjoy. Well, Frank, first, I just want to say thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you for this book that we are going to go into. It has already impacted the way I think. So Thanks all around.
Well, you're welcome, Chris. I'm really happy to be with you and to also have the listeners enjoy our conversation.
Yes, and I have a feeling we're going to take them on quite a journey today. and I want to start here. Before we get into anything else, we're talking about death, but we're really talking about, in my opinion, life and living. And your book, The 5 Invitations. And right in the beginning, you say basically that this book is an invitation, 5, as a matter of fact, to sit down with death and to have a cup of tea with her, to let her guide you toward living a more meaningful and loving life. And I just want to read that to you and get your response. Where did that line come from, and why do you believe it to be true?
Well, I mean, partly it comes out of my own direct experience, but also it comes out of my experience of being with a couple of thousand people as they died. You start to see what are the patterns, what matters most, And I think without a reminder of death, we take life for granted, and we get lost in our self-gratification and we forget what's really essential. When we keep death close at hand, at our fingertips in a way, we get it. We understand that life is absolutely precarious. And because it is, it's also precious. And then we don't want to waste a moment. Then we want to jump into our life with both feet, live it fully and, not miss a moment of it. Yeah.
I wrote down one time, death is the only thing that is permanent, and therefore it is also the only thing that we really don't know when or how it's going to impact us. And I think that's a purposeful part of life, is to know that the one thing that's guaranteed, you don't know when it's going to happen. And that is how it can be a guide. That's how I think of it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's uncertain, right? The time of our dying is uncertain. How we die is uncertain. And, we all like to know, right? We like to be in charge. But death kind of cuts through that fantasy, that we are in charge of everything. When we step into uncertainty, when we start to get it, that our, life and the nature of the reality is not so different, then the fact that things are not fixed or solid, this becomes a kind of liberating opportunity rather than a threat, We step in more gracefully. It lends a kind of power to our life, actually. This spring in Japan, the hillsides were covered with beautiful flowers, right? Beautiful, beautiful cherry blossoms. There's a place I teach up in Idaho where there are these blue flax flowers that last just for a day, one day. Now, why is it that those cherry blossoms or those flax flowers are so beautiful? I think it's in part because of the brevity of their lives. They show us the beauty. The fact that things are always changing is part of what shows us how beautiful this life is. Yeah, that's what really, if that's what causes us to really want to embrace it and live it fully.
This idea of impermanence is something I think of a lot. I mean, one of the simplest examples off the top of my head, but it comes up for me, is I love playing golf, and I love getting out there and being in the flow with the sport and all the green. And sometimes I'll think that the fact that this round is going to end, okay, I know this is a different topic here, but the fact that this round is going to end and this time is going to go away and eventually it's going to be Monday and we all have to go back to work is what makes it so special. I kind of know that, but at the same time, that doesn't mean I want it to end. If I could have it be 8 hours or 4 days or a week, I would. And so I always question that balance of knowing the finite nature is what makes it special, but still not wanting it to be the case.
Yeah, both end, I think, absolutely. It's part of what gives life its, excitement, right? But it's also part of what scares us, right? That's the fact that things are uncertain or that death will come scares us. And so it's understandable that when we start to step into the beauty of this life, or into the enjoyment of even a golf game, we don't want it to end. We want it to keep going. Now, at the same time, we also rely on impermanence. We rely on constant change. That really boring dinner party that you're going to go to on Saturday night is going to come to an end, Evil dictatorships are going to fall, replaced by thriving democracies, we hope, yeah? Everything is coming and going all the time. And the difficulty we have with life is when we resist that truth, when we try to pretend that it's not the case. Yeah, that's when we really cause ourselves some degree of pain and discomfort.
One thing I also wanted to mention here is, I just got done not too long ago actually reading this book, and I spent the vast majority of today reading it, and it left me in this place of discomfort to some extent. And I wondered what that said about me. I mean, I could not help but to keep reading. I love this topic, but I hate the idea of it, because I'll picture things. And this happens a lot more as I age. I have a son now, my parents are getting older. They're not old, but they're getting older, where you start to realize what could happen. And this book really brought that to the forefront and put me on edge. How do you feel about that reaction?
Well, the first thing is I hope you keep reading and get to the end of the book. I think that it's natural for this to happen, because most of the time we keep death at arm's length, we try and keep it out of the picture, so to speak. And so when we invite it in, as you did when you started reading the book, it starts to challenge our habitual way of going through the world. And so I think that's part of what's happening is we're confronting something that's been there all along, a certain kind of apprehension or underground river of anxiety, that's been there all along about the subject that we've avoided. And so now we're saying, let's bring it into the light of day. Let's see what it has to show us. And at first, we're going to feel uncomfortable. As we stay with it, we begin to understand that there's incredible wisdom in that death has to teach us about living our lives. And that we don't want to miss that information. Everything we have done matters at the time of our dying. And so the question that's sort of starting to arise for me is, if the habits of our life have a kind of momentum that carry through into the time of our dying, what habits do we want to create? Do we want to create habits of avoidance and denial, or do we want to create habits of learning to turn toward, to face fully what it is that scares us?
You go through that a little bit in the beginning, that idea of changing habits, changing outcomes and character to have a better, and this is my words, but this feeling about our death. And I put myself in that situation whenever it may be, if I have the luxury of contemplating my life before my death, wondering how much of that will I actually care about, right? And here's the reason I struggle. If everything is impermanent and I'm dying, and I know that in a short period of time, at that juncture, I will no longer be here, why do my previous actions even matter if I'm going to be gone and no longer aware of them?
Well, they matter now, I mean, dying is inevitable and intimate, and I've seen really ordinary people go to their dying and develop really profound understandings through this powerful process of transformation that dying is, right? They become more of themselves. They become something bigger and larger than the small personality they took themselves to be. And this regularly occurs for people. Now, we might say that's too late, and I would agree. Let's not wait until the time of our dying to make that discovery. Let's figure out and understand something about who we are now so that we can fully engage in our life. Yeah. So it's not so much about what you leave behind, although legacy is important for a lot of people. It's more like how fully, how completely have I lived my life? Yeah. And I think that death gives us that mirror to look in that helps us to really get it, This is important. This life right here, right now, this is what's most important, And I don't want to miss a moment of it, You were saying about you have a young child and you want to be there, right? You really want to be there. You don't want to miss any of it, yeah? So I think that the specter of death or the specter of constant change causes us to really see that I love this life. I love this life, yeah? And we don't have to wait until the time of our dying to learn the lessons that it has to teach.
If you could describe for us somebody who, upon dying or as they're approaching death, feels that they've done it right, feels that, you know what, I wouldn't change things. I'm comfortable with where I am. I think that goal that many of us had, a life well lived, that versus those that feel the opposite, okay? Full of regret, wishing, upon wishing that they could do it over again. If you've seen those, could you tell us the differences or the biggest difference perhaps? Because this is the closest some of us will get to understanding this truth, is talking to you about it, having witnessed so many and been such a part of it and a thinker around this. If we could almost game the system a little bit in a weird way of putting it, and learn from that, what would you say it is?
Well, I think there's a lot of conversation out there about what are the primary regrets that people have as they die. And that's a useful conversation. But, what I think what we imagine is we get that list, we won't do those things. And so then life and death will go very smoothly. I'm more interested in, well, what did people discover in the time of their dying that's really valuable? Like there was a guy I worked with. He lived on the streets of San Francisco, and I met him in a psychiatric unit at the county hospital. And he was in the psychiatric unit because he had terminal lung cancer, and he couldn't imagine that there was any value to his life. And so he tried to kill himself. That's what wound him up in the psychiatric unit. So I went into the psychiatric unit, and they can be very sort of stark places. And I sat in this metal chair, and he was turned toward the wall, this kind of hospital green wall. And I just sat there for a long time. And after a while, he turned over, looked over his shoulder at me, and he said, "Who are you? Nobody's ever sat with me this long in silence." And I told him who I was and that I was from the hospice. And I asked him a really simple question. I said, "What do you want?" And he said, "Spaghetti." and I said, "Well, we make really good spaghetti. Why don't you come live with us?" And he said, "Okay." And that was the end of the admissions interview. Now, the next day, he arrived at our hospice from the psychiatric unit. And we had a big bowl of spaghetti waiting for him, because you understand, spaghetti meant home and nurturance and familiarity. Now, he didn't stop wanting to kill himself just because we gave him spaghetti. I mean, it was good spaghetti, but it wasn't that good. So he and I developed a really honest relationship. And he didn't, he wanted to really continue to explore taking his life. And this was long before the 5 states in our country that have allowed physician-assisted dying. And so there was a book at the time that told you how to take your life if you were dying. And I got him this book. And we read a chapter of it each night. Each night we read a chapter. In the end, he didn't actually take his life. In fact, the day before he died, he said, "Frank, I want to thank you. I'm happier now than I've ever been in my life." And I said, "How is that possible?" I said, "Just a few weeks ago, you wanted to kill yourself because you couldn't write in your journals or walk in the park." He said, "Oh, that was just chasing desire." I said, "What do you mean? You mean these activities aren't important to you anymore?" He said, "No, it's not the activities that bring me joy. It's the attention to the activities." He said, "Now my pleasure comes from the coolness of the breeze and the softness of the sheets." Now, I thought this was a remarkable turnaround for a guy I met in a psychiatric unit. What he really began to understand was how by bringing our attention fully and completely to whatever we're doing, that's where we really find our contentment, that's where we find our happiness. And so it wasn't about reviewing his life and saying, "Gee, I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish I'd done more of that." It was more like, what I learned here at the time of my dying is how to pay attention, how to really pay attention, yeah? And it doesn't even matter so much what I'm paying attention to. It's the quality of the attention that brings me into a state of contentment and relaxation.
That's a powerful story. It reminds me of this conversation I recently had about trying to be present, right? So mindfulness is getting so much attention these days, and I think many times rightfully so in certain instances and areas. And what I have found is I try to be so mindful of the moment that I become aware of my want to be in the moment, right? Yeah. And that takes me out of it, right? And so an example is, as we mentioned, playing with my son, and I'll be just so happy for the time that I get. And then to be aware that moment is going to go away, right? And so I wonder, because I know you do talk a lot about Buddhist philosophy and Zen and things like that, what has death taught us about the willingness to be in that moment and be okay with the fact that it's going to end? In the same way, our lives are going to end.
Right, exactly. That's just it. That's the nature of things again, I mean, mindfulness, as you suggest, it's the kind of the new black, we think it's suitable for all occasions, and it is, as you suggest, it's really important, for people to learn to be mindful, but it's not just a life hack, Mindfulness is a kind of deconditioning, really. It cultivates a kind, merciful, awake presence in the mind that no longer blocks the heart, really. And so then we're free to see things as they are, and we allow the difficult and the dark and the dense to show itself. And we become more intimate with our pain and our difficulties, but also with the joy and the beauty of life, what it's like to embody our full humanity and to discover an even deeper sense of who we are. So, the pain doesn't come from the fact that it ends, that your time with your son and that playtime ends. It comes from the fact that you don't want it to end. And you cling to the fact that you don't want it to end, and it should be otherwise. It's like arguing with reality. It makes us crazy, and we always lose when we argue with reality. So rather, when we attune ourselves, when we live in some kind of harmony with the way things are, it's not just resignation. It's true acceptance. It's a true allowing. Okay, so now this is really changing. What can it show me? What can it show me about how to live my life with some degree of ease and an absence of worry and anxiety.
So acceptance in the fact that it's going to end, whatever it may be, can free you to experience it for what it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. When you think about it, when you eat an ice cream and it tastes really yummy, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if at the end of eating the ice cream you say, I want more, you forget about the enjoyment that you just had, right? You're sort of caught in a kind of cycle of, I got to get more all the time. And that creates a certain kind of anxiety and not so wholesome drive in us that has us always reaching for something outside ourselves for happiness.
One other thing that I want to check with you on is, and again, this might just be that it's personal, but we recently did a podcast on loneliness with a person named Guy Winch, and it struck a chord to many. So I think this will do the same. But to me, as I look at it now, death is the ultimate loneliness. And I hope my opinions and feelings on that change, because I don't want to be the one that gets to my deathbed just worried about what is to come. And I hate that idea, right? Of when you die being lonely, right? Being completely and utterly separate. And that is how I'm currently viewing death. How do you view the relationship between death and loneliness?
That's a great question, Chris. That's a really great question, and probably not one that we can, answer in bulleted points.
Right.
Because we have to really live into that to really understand. We have to see the sort. What are my beliefs about this? What are my beliefs and views about what happens when we die from, the actual experience? Just coming back for a second, I just want to say acceptance is not resignation. Acceptance is an opening to possibility. And this openness is the basis for a skillful response to life. So what happens after we die? I don't know exactly. I don't know. I mean, I've been around thousands of people now. And one of the questions that I always ask them is, what do you think is going to happen after you die? And it's not like I think there's a right answer to this, but I think that the way in which people respond to that question shapes the way in which they die, and perhaps even the way in which they live their lives. Like, there was a guy I worked with, he was the president of the California Atheist Association, and he came to us at Zen Hospice to die, and I was very proud of that. I was glad that he thought we weren't going to push any dogma on him. I'm not interested in dogma. I'm curious. So I asked him a question, but I asked everybody, what do you think is going to happen after you die? And he said, nothing. I said, what do you mean nothing? Like, will you have a nose? Will you have ears? No, you don't have a nose and ears. And I said, well, what do you mean nothing? I said, is it like a dial tone, Mm-hmm. And he said, no, it's not like a dial tone. He said, it's like all the molecules that you are go out and merge with all the other molecules in the universe. That was his notion. I said, oh, what? He's going to be okay, There was another guy I worked with. He was a 30-year heroin user, African-American man, 30 years he used heroin, right? Really came off the streets to our hospice. And I said the same thing to him. I said, Jackie, here you are at this Buddhist hospice. I said, do you think you're going to get born again? He said, yep. And I said, well, what are you going to come back as? You're going to come back as a king or a queen, or, in some cultures you could come back as a cow. That's really sacred. And he said, I'm not coming back as no goddamn cow. And I said, well, what are you coming back as? And he said, Jackie. I said, Jackie? Why you want to be Jackie for? He said, because next time I'm going to get it right. And you see, we're into a whole different conversation now, Chris, We were really in a conversation where we were talking about this very life, the one he's in the middle of, So again, I think that when we reflect on this, it shows us how we're thinking about this life. So when we have an idea that death is only loneliness and separation, it behooves us to take a look at our life and see, where are we separating? Where are we pulling ourselves apart from other people? Why do we think we need to separate in order to be unique, and to be differentiated? I mean, we live in this world that's incredibly diverse, right? Unbelievably diverse, but it's not fundamentally separate. I was just in Hawaii with my friends who are big wave surfers, and, they try and teach me about the waves. And I don't always understand everything they're talking about, to be honest with you. But what I see is that each wave is absolutely unique and beautiful. And they all crash on the shore and they all get sucked back out to the ocean, And the fact that they crash on the shore doesn't cause me to not enjoy them when they're taking form and shape in all their beauty and power. So they're not, I think we're like that. I don't think that we're fundamentally separate. I think that we are unique, beautiful individuals. And I love that about this life, And I love that reality takes shape through all of us in really different ways. And that's part of the beauty that dying reveals to us.
And it's funny that you ended that with, that's what's unique about what dying reveals to us, because I just had a quick note that I wrote down as you were talking, that it sounds like you sometimes might view death as a mirror, that when we look at it, we can see what it is about our current state that is either bothering us or perhaps that we are content with. And so first of all, I don't want to put that as your words. I'm wondering, what about that do you agree or disagree with, and how we can use that mirror right now where we all are listening?
Yeah, good for you. That's a great question. And for me, the eyes of a dying patient are the clearest mirrors that I've ever looked into.
Wow.
And they show, they just are, they show me myself. They show me where I'm holding, where I'm trying to exercise more control, where I need to be more flexible. They show me the, aversions that I have in life, But they also show me my beauty, and they also show me my capacity for compassion, and they also show me my capacity to love, right? So mirrors reflect back what they see, they reflect back the truth of what's actually there. That's what mirrors do, right? And so, death is such a mirror. It shows us how we're actually living our life, and it doesn't pull punches. It says, this is how it is. This is how you are right now, right here, right now. And that's why, when Steve Jobs was dying, right, he said, the best life hack, death is the best life hack that you've never used. And because remembering that we're going to be dead soon is the most important tool that helps us to really make choices in our life, set priorities. Again, to acknowledge what's really important, if you knew that this was the last week of your life, how would you want to spend time with your son? What might you do differently? What would you give up? What would you move toward? So I think it has that kind of sobering, clarifying, like a sword of discrimination, that really cuts through all the crap and shows us, where we should be placing our attention.
One thing that this idea brings up for me is, you ask, if I had a week left, how would I spend that time with my son, etc. And sometimes I think, well, I tell you what I wouldn't do, right? I wouldn't go on this work trip I have to go on. Not because I dislike the work, but because of the squeezing in of relationships and whatnot. How can we balance that balance the idea of, okay, death is coming for us. Are we spending our time in the best possible way as we see fit versus necessity and the fact that, well, it might not be tomorrow, right? So I can't take all my savings, go buy that sports car, drive at 100 miles an hour, et cetera, because that would be irresponsible. How do we balance that?
Yeah, I mean, it's great because, one, I think what happens is, again, in the sobering quality that brings forward to us. And again, I don't think this is morbid at all. I think this is life affirming, actually, to include a reflection on death. I think when we do, we greet life with much more curiosity. So in the case that you just described, or the situation you just described, you have to go on that business trip, right? That's part of the deal.
Yeah.
So, but you also can turn to your son and say, I got to go away on this business trip, but the thing that's most important to me in my life is you, And so even when I'm on this business trip and I'm away from you, I'm going to have you in my heart, I'm going to be carrying you with me everywhere I go, because that's what really matters to me. I think that's how we do it. It's not like it's either or, we pick black or white, but rather it starts to be included and shapes the way in which we conduct our relationships. Yeah.
One of the themes in your book and in this thought is you still talk a lot about our relationship to other people. And I find that interesting because given that death essentially represents your inability to have physical relationships with other people, you still use it as a magnifying glass to what your current relationships are. So I know you talk about it in terms of looking back on how your actions impacted others and affected others. Is that a theme that you found through your work? Is that the way we impact and affect others with our lives is one of the things we deem most important at our deaths?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when people look back on their lives as they're dying, they naturally reflect about what was the influence of their life on the world, in their relationships, etc. So it's reasonable for people to want to do that. And sometimes when we look back, we tend to look back critically. We tend to look back and judge ourselves or judge our actions. And I think it's important there when we're with someone in that situation to really emphasize the positive, not in some Pollyanna way, but to really help people remember the powerful and loving effect that they've had on others. But I think that one of the mistakes we make is that we start thinking about death as this point at the end of a long road, and then we look back over our lives, as opposed to saying, death is there now. How do I want to live this life? In other words, how do I use this to live this life with veracity and integrity? How do I step in with tremendous wonder and curiosity and awe into this life? That's what interests me more. Not looking back, but actually looking forward, and finding a way of being quite present in the situation, whatever situation we find ourselves in. So that's why I gave that example of, imagine you had only a week to live. Then, wow, wouldn't this week be really alive? Yeah. Wouldn't it be so full? I mean, I don't know what happens after we die. Maybe we have multiple lifetimes. Maybe nothing happens, Here's the question. Imagine there were multiple lifetimes, right? Well, then how would you want to live this life? Well, you might say, well, I want to live this life with integrity, with love, with clarity, wisdom, so that I would set up the conditions for another great life. Let's imagine that's the case. I'd say, okay, great. Now, imagine that there's nothing that happens after you die. Imagine it's just a dial tone.
Right.
Well, then how would you want to live? Oh, I want to live this life with integrity, with clarity, with as much love as possible, because it's the only chance I got. Yeah. So in a way, it's not so important to be able to answer that question about what happens. It's more like how does the reflection cause you to live your life here and now?
This week's episode is brought to you by Be Frugal. If you're an online shopper, you have to try Be Frugal Cashback. It's like free money. Be Frugal lets you earn up to 40% cash back on your purchases from over 5,000 stores, including Amazon, Walmart, Target, Macy's, and more. It's like getting paid to shop. Simply find the online store where you want to shop, click the link on BeFrugal.com to activate cash back, and complete your purchase. You can even stack your coupons and cash back to get the best deal possible. Then money will report in your BeFrugal account within a few days and become payable within 30 to 90 days. Members can request money via check, PayPal, or Amazon gift card. Plus, if you have any questions, members also have access to helpful customer support from BeFrugal's team of US-based specialists. You're already shopping online, why not get paid for it? It's so easy, you'll never shop online without BeFrugal again. So listen up. This is what you need to do. Visit befrugal.com/smart and get a $10 bonus when you join for free. That's befrugal.com/smart. And now back to the episode.
Well, and I think at this point, people hopefully are thinking, you're right. I want to look at this more deeply, which is where your book comes in. And I want to talk about that. I also want to give our listeners a chance to learn a little bit more about you and especially what you do at the Zen Hospice Project. But before we do that, this is something that just jumped out to me. I'm wondering, how do you currently view death given your experience with it? Having seen people die, having seen the sadness, I think, that often accompanies it and the families that are impacted by it. How do you see that?
Well, I'm not romantic about dying. It's really hard work, toughest work we may ever do in our whole lives, and it doesn't always turn out well. I mean, it can be sad and cruel and awful, but it also can be beautiful and mysterious and full of transformation and growth. But, most of all, after being with thousands of people, I think it's normal. I think we all go through it. I think none of us get out of here alive. In that way, it's ordinary, in a way. And so I think of death as the secret teacher that's hiding in plain sight, Death isn't something that just happens to us at the end of a long road. It's in the marrow of every moment. It's right here, right now, all the time. And so I have a much more familiar, I want to say, or personal relationship with death. And don't think of it just as something that comes at the end of a long life. It's right here, right now. It can happen today. And it's not just about our life ending. This moment ended. Like we could pull the word death out of our conversation and just talk about endings, and talk about how do we meet endings. How do you meet the end of a sentence, the end of a meal, the end of a lovemaking, the end of a day? Yeah. How do you meet endings? And I think if we learn something about that, it shows us that, first of all, the way we meet an ending tends to shape the way the next beginning occurs, right? And so it causes us to live our life with more attention, more mindfulness, more consciousness. How do you leave a party? Do you just ghost out when everybody, when it's time to go? Or do you say goodbye to people? Do you say thank you? And I was just in Italy teaching over there, and in an Italian culture, you don't have a dinner party where you don't say goodbye to everybody who was there and thank them and say something particular to them, was specific about your interactions with them. So I think the way we meet endings in our life really matters, and those are the little deaths, if you will, that happen all the time.
I really like that, and I like that example about leaving a party, because I've had numerous conversations about that and the old Irish goodbye and just, well, I'll see you later. And it seems slightly harmless, but if it does impact, like you talk about, if it becomes a habit, if that's how all endings are treated with carelessness, perhaps, then it might be indicative of something else. Frank, I want to learn a little bit more about you. How did you get to studying this subject, which is so pushed to the back burner? Yeah.
I mean, we like I said earlier, we want to keep it at arm's length. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to see it. I mean, now I think that's changing. I think people are having much more honest conversations like the one that we're having about it, where it's kind of out of the closet, and we can start to talk about it in a real and useful way. I got to be familiar with death really early on. My mom died when I was a teenager, and my dad just a few years later. So death and I were early companions, and it, propelled me into my life very quickly, as a young man. I worked in refugee camps where I saw a lot of horrible dying in southern Mexico and Central America. And I thought there's got to be something else that we can do about this. When my son was being born, I went and studied with the master. Her name was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was the pioneer in death and dying. And she sort of took me under her wing and invited me back to shadow her and learn from her, And then the AIDS epidemic hit in San Francisco. And, we had 30,000 people die of AIDS in San Francisco in the 80s, 90s. And none of us knew what we were doing. We were sort of making it up as we went along. I mean, 30,000 people in one city. Can you imagine, It was like an unbelievable epidemic. And, I was with people, sometimes 20 or 30 people in a week that died. Yeah. And so death and I got really up close and personal. Yeah. And what I noticed in my life is that I started feeling more alive, actually. I wasn't depressed. I didn't burn out. I started feeling more alive. I started to really be more conscious about the ways in which I lived my life and how I interacted with others. I don't have any degrees. I didn't graduate from college because I had to support my family. I have a younger brother, etc. And so the only, certificate or I have is a Red Cross life-saving certificate I got when I was 16 years old. I'm sure it's probably expired by now, but that's the only degree I have. So people who were dying taught me. Yeah. In the middle of the AIDS epidemic, when we didn't know what to do, I worked as an aide between midnight and 8 in the morning, the graveyard hours, where I was with people in the most intimate, the most vulnerable moments of their life, And if I was going to be helpful to them, I had to be real, I had to be really clear about my relationships to illness and to dying, And I couldn't use any rhetoric. They would sniff out my sentimentality and my insincerity, and they'd yell bullshit, So death has caused me to be real with people, to be honest, to be completely myself, That's been its really great teaching to me, to not live under the illusion I have endless time, to be real in my relationships with people, and to be endlessly curious, because dying is like getting born, Each experience is completely unique. We never know how it's going to turn out exactly, And there, when the veils are really thin between the worlds, we see what really matters most, And often it's, our simple human kindness, our ability to be present for one another. And so that's really become what's most essential in my life. Yeah. That's a long answer to the question.
No, it's fantastic to learn and see how that happened. And I know some of your experiences and they're outlined in your book. Tell us a little bit, how'd you get to the Zen Hospice Project?
Well, the Zen Hospice Project, we started in the mid-'80s, right? And in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. And I had worked in a couple of other hospices before, and my whole life had really been about service up until then. But what we were trying to do was put together people who were cultivating what we might call the listening mind or the listening heart through meditation practice or mindfulness practice, and put them together with people who really needed to be heard, folks who were dying. They needed to be heard at least once in their life. And so it was a kind of fusion of spiritual insight and very practical social action. We worked, for the most part, in the beginning with people living on the streets of San Francisco. So I changed diapers on park benches behind City Hall and taught prostitutes how to care for their johns and desk clerks in single-room occupancy hotels how to care for the residents in those buildings.
Wow.
And so, it was very close to the ground, really close to the ground. And we didn't know. We didn't really know what we were doing. We were making it up as we went along, but there was nobody else doing it. So we just stepped in to fill that gap, and that vacuum. And the people who were dying showed us, they showed us what was most important. They showed us how to do it. They showed us what they needed most. And our job was to really accompany them and companion them as opposed to guide them, really. I don't know how people should die. Everybody dies differently. My job is to figure out how does this person need to go through this process, and how can I support them as they go through that process in the way that best suits them.
Have you seen any commonalities at the end, really, with people in how they either think or how they want to be treated, given your experience? Because I know that was triggered by, you mentioned so many, everybody dies differently, but have you noticed anything that actually ties them all together?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are patterns that as human beings we experience, that are common. They commonly show up rather in the time of dying. And then, of course, as I just suggested, there's this really unique way in which people go through it, based on their own conditioning, et cetera. So I think, generally speaking, in most cultures, people's outer circles start to shrink. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's what's happening is, if you think of concentric circles, they're withdrawing from the outer circles of their life. So maybe they pull back from some of their work relationships or some of their community relationships, and they pull into a much more intimate circle of people. That's one of the things that happens, I think. I think another thing is that all of the ways that we've defined ourselves, I'm a Buddhist teacher, you're a podcaster, we're all the different ways that we define ourselves, these are stripped away by illness or gracefully given up. And then we find something much more fundamental in ourselves, something more of a common ground with one another. I think that happens an awful lot when people are dying. I think when I boil it down, two questions become really important to people as they're dying. And they don't always shape them or speak them in this particular way, but in one fashion or another, they ask the question, am I loved? Does somebody love me? And did I love well, in this life? Did I love well in this life? And sometimes the answers to those things are no, and sometimes that becomes the really important work of the final weeks, months, days of their lives, to learn how to love and how to receive love. I'd say that's a really common, the most common human experience that I see near the end of life. Well, also, I mean, we got to be real here too. Many people in our culture are dying in fear and regret. Mm-hmm. They're leaving skid marks, dragging their heels toward death, And I think we can do something about that. I mean, I think it's because we're not having the kinds of conversations that you and I are having now, that people are, death is the great, boogeyman, the great taboo. And so the more familiar we get with it, the more we kind of include it in our lives, I think that's the way we diminish that fear and that regret.
When you mentioned the commonality of am I loved and did I love well, I mean, the fact that at the end of it all, when you're staring down the end of your existence as you know it, the question is love at the core of it all. Have you ever thought about why that is, or what is it about love? It's not about anything other than that one emotion. Well, why is that? I mean, I'm formulating this as I go, and so maybe we can't even get to it here, but I'm just wondering your thoughts.
Well, I think it takes us back to what you were saying about your own fears about dying, that it's it's a process of loneliness and causes a great deal of separation. I think fundamentally we belong to one another, and some part of us, deep intuitive part of us, understands this. We understand that we're in this soup together, and so that's part of it, is the deep sense and the deep need to belong. It means that it's one of our instinctual drives, the social drive. It's not just to go to parties, it's that I have a sense of belonging, right? So that's the first thing I think that really is there, that's fundamental to our very nature. I think also that this love that we speak of here, it's not just the emotional experience, not just the romantic experience of love, that we could think about it as something that's woven into the very fabric of our life, that's inseparable. It's like wetness to water, Love is that central and that integral to every dimension of our life, I mean, I'm going to ask you that question. If you think about what is it that really has the most value for you now, right? Not just at the time of dying, but now. Inevitably, you're going to speak about your relationships. You're going to talk about your child, And so if that's important now, well, it's like, if that's the most important thing now, it's because it's the most important thing then. Yeah. And again, that's the really good news here. We don't have to wait until the time of our dying to learn what it has to teach. I think that the value here is use death as a mirror. Use death to show you how to live your life here and now.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I do want to get into this book, which really we're having a conversation about. I mean, this whole conversation has been about it, but to get specific, it's called The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully, and it embraces a lot of what we've been talking about. Would you, though, first share with us, why is it, and I know you cover this in the book, but I'd like to hear it from you, why do you call them invitations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've called them different things over the years. I've talked about them as precepts or guidelines or these kind of things. But really, I thought of them as invitations because, when you get an invitation, it's a call, right? It's a call to be present for something, right? Come to this party, come to our wedding, right? It's a call to be present. And so these invitations are a call to be present for your life, So that's why I think of them as invitations. And by the way, they all came to me from people who were dying. They were all things that, those patterns that you were talking about a little while ago are these 5 invitations, what kind of boiled down to the essential truths that folks who were dying showed me.
Would you mind giving us a brief overview of those 5? And then I have some kind of pointed questions for those that are interested. Sure.
And, I'll just give you a really quick summary of them.
Sure.
So the first invitation is don't wait. Don't wait. It's one of my favorite ones. And it's not about just getting all the toys you can get. Don't wait means don't wait to tell someone that you love them. Waiting is full of expectation. Waiting for the next moment to arrive, we missed this one. I can't tell you how many times I've been with people who are dying and they've said to me, when am I going to die? Or when is my mom going to die? And waiting for the moment of dying, we miss all the moments in between. So to imagine that at the time of our dying, we will have the physical strength, the emotional stability, the mental clarity to do the work of a lifetime is a ridiculous gamble. So let's not wait until the time of our dying to learn what it has to teach us. That's the first one, okay? Second one is a little bit more challenging. It's welcome everything, push away nothing. Welcome everything, push away nothing. Now, this really challenges us. Welcoming really challenges our whole sense of judgment. And people imagine that they have to, reject things in order to be safe. So this welcoming isn't about agreeing with everything. It isn't about liking everything that comes. It's just a willingness to meet it. It's at your doorstep. What can it show me? So the great writer James Baldwin, African-American writer James Baldwin said, there are many things in life that we must face that we cannot change, but nothing can be changed unless we're willing to face it. Yeah. So to welcome everything and push away nothing has that kind of integrity to it. The third one is bring your whole self to the experience. Bring your whole self to the experience. A lot of times we all like to look good, right? We long to be seen as capable and strong and intelligent and all of that, spiritual or whatever it is, well-adjusted at least, And so we project this positive self-image onto the world. And few of us want to be known for our helplessness or our fear or anger or our ignorance, or that sometimes we're more of a mess than we like to admit. So to be whole means to include it all, to accept it all, to connect with all parts of ourself. And this wholeness is not about perfection. It means no part of ourself is left out. Yeah? So that's to bring your whole self to the experience. The fourth one is find a place of rest in the middle of things. Now, we're usually thinking we're going to find rest later, when we get our list checked off and when we go on a holiday. But I don't know about you, but my list never gets checked off. So if I wait until, my list is all done or my email inbox is empty, I'll never rest. So I have to learn to find rest right in the middle of what I'm doing, yeah? And that place of rest isn't dependent upon the circumstances of our life. It's dependent upon quality of attention that we bring forward. It's a choice, really, to be alert, to bring your attention to this moment. Okay, the fifth one and last one is called cultivate don't know mind. Now, what does that mean? I mean, I felt it's kind of Zen-y, right? And I felt obliged to put something Zen-like in this list, But the cultivate don't know mind, it seems confusing at first. Why would we want to cultivate being ignorant? Why would we seek to be ignorant? But Ignorance is not knowing. Ignorance is that we know something, but we misperceive it, and then we insist on it being true. There's a lot of that going on in our world right now. We misunderstand things. Yeah. So don't know mind is a mind that's open, that's receptive. It doesn't throw out our learning. It's right there, got it at our back, to help us. But it's receptive. It's ready to meet whatever shows up. Yeah. It's an invitation to enter life with fresh eyes, to empty our minds and open our hearts. Yeah. It's a mind that's characterized by surprise, by awe, by wonder. Yeah. So that's the 5 invitations, right? Don't wait. Welcome everything, push away nothing. Bring your whole self to the experience. Find a place of rest in the middle of things. And number 5, cultivate don't know mind. Yeah. So that's a very brief summary of an overview of what the book's really about.
As I mentioned, I was going through them this morning, and they all jump out for different reasons. I figured, the 2 that really struck me and some I struggle with, I might highlight to give people a deeper sense of what you discuss and how you go about discussing it in the book. But I really can't recommend it enough. I mean, it was a really a deep, 4 hours in which I got through a lot of it, not the entire thing, but a lot of it. And we'll probably go sit on my porch after this and finish it. The first thing I want to ask is something you highlighted, which was in number 2, that welcome everything, push away nothing. And I do feel like that was the most challenging. And, it actually brought something up for me. I recently dealt with, kind of will probably forever deal with something that was life-changing and difficult. And I remember talking to my dad about it, and I said, he said, what's the biggest problem? And I said, well, it's just that I can't rationalize the fact that this happened and it is suboptimal, right? It is suboptimal. And that's the best words I could use. But in a little more clarity, I went and thought about it. And to some extent, that's such a ridiculous statement to get so worked up over something that is just below optimal. And it's what number 2 made me question, was this idea of, how do I welcome something that I really don't want? Like, I really don't.
Yeah. There's a lot of things in my life I really don't want, and I don't, I'm not suggesting that we should become doormats, for other people's intrusions onto our life, or that, we become Pollyanna and everything's great, What I'm suggesting is it's true. It's here, right? This suboptimal thing that you're describing, it's here. It's part of your life. So now what? Denying its existence and trying to push it away doesn't help me at all. It just pushes it underground, right? So I'm willing to meet it. I got it. Here it is. It's at my doorstep. And now I have some agency. I have some power, right? When I'm denying it, it's got all the power. It's got, it's going to rule my life. So, it's like it's your wedding day and it rains, right? Well, it's not your fault, right, that it rains. But here it is. So now how can we deal with this, So we get out umbrellas and give them to all our guests, or we snuggle up together under a particular tent or an eave or something like that. We're not victim to our experiences when we're willing to welcome it and meet it. Yeah. And that's really the difference. It gives us some quality of agency.
The other one that struck me, number 4, find a place of rest in the middle of things. And I think that is such a great idea, and the way you discuss it, so necessary as things seemingly get crazier. You tell a story of a woman named Adele, and she was essentially dying, right, in the midst of it. And the story was so powerful because it didn't change the outcome, but it changed her experience and, the ease of which, I guess, that transition was made. So I'm wondering, with stories like that, with your experiences like that, how do we find this rest in a world that is seemingly trying to get us to not rest?
Yeah. I mean, we're all dancing as fast as we can, right? Trying to juggle as many plates as we can possibly manage, and, multitasking until we're exhausted. I think that one of the things that helps us is to actually slow down just for a moment, even if it's not for taking a big break, just for a moment, and let ourselves feel oftentimes just how exhausted we are from all this running around, and begin to understand how invested we are in being exhausted. Yeah. I mean, when I ask people how you doing, they always say, "Oh, busy, man, really busy." Yeah. Or they tell me just how hard they're working or how exhausted they are. And sometimes they're saying that because they want someone to say back to them, "Oh, man, you're really dedicated. Oh, you're really doing a great job," And so sometimes I think we unconsciously invest in our exhaustion. There's this really great phenomenon that happens sometimes for people when they've been diagnosed with cancer. And they talk about it with each other, but not so much publicly. And they talk about something which we might call a secret gratitude. Secret gratitude, like, okay, I've been diagnosed with cancer. Now I can finally say no to all those things that I don't want to do. Yeah, I can say no to that dinner party. I can say no to this particular kind of work, And I can say yes to what really matters to me. That's a secret gratitude. Again, we don't need to get diagnosed with a life-threatening illness to make that choice. Adele, when you were talking about, she was this rough, tough, Russian Jewish lady, and the night she was dying, I came to her room and she was sitting on the edge of her bed, her feet sort of dangling off the edge of the bed. And I sat in the corner and the nurse's assistant was with her. And in a very well-meaning way, she said to Adele, you don't have to be scared. We're right here with you. And Adele, who is this tough cookie, she shot back, "Of course I'm scared. And if this was happening to you, you'd be scared too," like that, And so I stayed in the corner. And then this very sweet, attendant, nurse's aide said to her, "Adele, would you like a blanket? You look a little cold." And she went to wrap a shawl around her. And Adele said, "Of course I'm cold. I'm almost dead." Yeah. I mean, this woman was ferocious. And so I saw two things there as I was sitting there. One is that she was struggling. She was struggling with her breath. She was dying. She was actively dying. And there's a labor to dying, just like there's a labor to getting born, And although we'd made all the correct interventions medically, still there's a labor to it. There's a struggle. So she was struggling, and the struggle was showing up in her breath. And the second thing was that she wanted honest relationships. She didn't want to talk about tunnels of light or any of this stuff. She just wanted somebody to be real with her. So I pulled up my chair, sat right in front of her, looked her in the eye, and I said, "Adele, would you like to struggle a little bit less?" And she said, "Yes." And so I said, "Okay, I noticed this gap there at the end of the exhale, just before the next inhale, when there's this little pause. What would it be like if you just put your attention there for a moment?" And so I said, "I'll do it with you, Now, I didn't teach her to breathe in some particular way or do any kind of fancy stuff. I just was breathing with her. As she would breathe in, I would breathe in. As she would breathe out, I would breathe out. And I noticed that as she put her attention there in that little gap at the end of the exhale, the fear in her face just drained away, And then after a few minutes, she said, "I want to lay back on my pillow now." And she laid back down on her pillow. And a few minutes later, she died very peacefully. So I think what happened was that Adele found a place of rest in the middle of things. You see, all the conditions were still the same. She was still dying. There was still shortness of breath. None of those conditions had really changed, but she found a place of rest right in the middle of things. Yeah, we're always trying to manipulate the conditions of our life to get rest, and I think we can find it, and it's always available to us, right here, right now. Yeah.
Frank, I know it's we're getting to that time. We got to go, and I'm wondering if you could leave us with. We're gonna turn this podcast off. Those listening, wherever they are in their life, in their world, what and to many, myself included, I still have this unease, right? I still have this anxiety about this whole topic that I don't know when or how long it will take to dissipate, and I hope it changes me for the better. But if you could leave us with something to take this idea, to take the knowledge that we've gained today, of course, we're going to talk about your book one more time, but what would you like people to take away and do differently that might impact their life as opposed to just talking about the end?
Yeah, great. That's a really great question. Beautiful way to end. So what I would say is learn to turn toward your experience. Learn to turn toward what it is that frightens you, Like if you're having some restlessness or, anxiousness about the subject, turn toward it. Find out Get familiar with it, learn what it has to show you. We're always trying to run away from our suffering, and it smacks us in the back of the head, takes us by surprise. So learn to turn toward your experience, to become familiar with it. I think that's the most important thing. And if we cultivate that habit all the time, whatever it is, some moment of frustration, some moment of, anxiousness, then that gets to be a developed habit, a cultivated habit that becomes the way in which we meet the world. Yeah. And we meet the world with more fearlessness, with more curiosity, more willingness to discover. Yeah. So in my view, anyway, the contemplation of death and the inherent mystery of our life, and that's part of that experience, is too important to be left to the final hours of our life. Yeah. Coming to terms with our fears and discovering what dying has to teach us are essential to our transformation, to our lives having meaning and purpose. So don't go back to sleep. Yeah, don't go back to sleep.
I love it. Well, Frank, again, thank you so much for your time. Your insight is incredible. What you've learned and then sharing it with the world in things like this podcast and the Zen Hospice Project. And then, of course, this book. I'm just so thankful. The book is The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. And we will link to this on smartpeoplepodcast.com. I would like to leave it with you. Anywhere else that you are, where you would like to guide people or the work that you're doing, now's the chance, because I'm sure people are eager to know more.
Well, one, you should know that I retired from the Zen Hospice Project and started another nonprofit called the Metta Institute, METTA. Mm-hmm. And that really is about teaching people how to mindfully and compassionately care for folks who are dying. So there's that work to be done. They can come to our website, mettainstitute.org, or they can go to the 5invitations.com, and there they can get information not only about my schedule, what I'm doing, but also there's a lot of great stuff there, free downloads about living more fully, about caring for friends and family, about working with grief. So I would like to, encourage people to go to that website and see what we have to offer.
And that's the 5invitations.com, correct?
Yeah, 5invitations.com. That's it.
Fantastic. And we will link to that as well. And I can't wait to go check those out for myself. So again, Frank, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Hey, Chris, thank you. And I really thank you for everything you're doing. Actually, the podcast is brilliant. And I really appreciate you having the courage to have this particular conversation. I think the world needs it right now. And I'm really grateful to you for engaging me in it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it was a blast. Everything I hope for and more. Your work is incredible. And this will not be the last time we talk. I promise you that.
Hey, Chris, thanks again. It's great that you did this.
Yeah, thank you. Talk soon.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Frank Ostaseski. His book, The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully, can be found at your local bookstore and on Amazon. And as always, if you decide to purchase it through Amazon, please make sure to use the Smart People Podcast Amazon link located at smartpeoplepodcast.com/Amazon. It's an easy way to support the show that comes to no extra cost to you. And if you're looking for other free and easy ways to support the show, you can always head over to Apple Podcasts or iTunes and leave a rating and review over there. We would greatly appreciate that. Make sure you head over to smartpeoplepodcast.com to stay up to date on all things Smart People Podcast. You can sign up for the newsletter. If you ever want to reach out to the show, you can email us at smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com or message us on Twitter @smartpeoplepod. All right, that's it for us this week. Hope you enjoyed the interview. Stay tuned as we've got some awesome interviews coming up, and we will see you all next episode.